This episode is part of a podcast series hosted by Freda. The series includes both talks about current events as well as interviews regarding labour market relations. You can check us out at freda.org for more information or connect with us via social media. On today's episode, we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, information in general in social media. In our very improvised studio, we have today me, Minia, and Mariel.
Hi.
So when I think about misinformation, what comes to my head is first, and I think most of Marvel fans will enjoy my analogy here, is the scene in Ant-Man where Louis is talking to Scott about a robbery he wants to do. He's gotten information about this rich man from his girlfriend, who got the information from his her coworker, etc., etc., and by a long chain of commands, the information is now from Louise to Scott. Um, they went to rob Hank Pym, and in the end, it happened to be that Hank Pym himself wanted to be connected to these two guys, hence he planted the information. But is it really so? What is the notion between misinformation, disinformation, and information?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I guess we are all familiar with, to some extent, with what information is, and then
Yeah.
misinformation and disinformation both are to some extent like expressions of wrongful information. So I think based on the example that you just illustrated, which I am not familiar with,
You should watch Ant-Man.
yes,
Come on.
yes, I should definitely. So I guess that illustrates both of these terms. So I guess to some extent the origin of this story would be disinformation. So it was like intentional placement of wrongful information with the intent to malinform other people.
Yeah.
And then the reproduction of that illustrates misinformation. So you have information that is shared out of the lack of knowledge of the truthful information. So you have channels like, for example, social media or literally like face to face conversations where people reproduce whatever they have heard and they don't know that this is wrong.
Yeah.
So then it becomes misinformation because I share a story out of my general concern of the situation.
Yeah.
And I think this is truthful. So I reproduce this, tell people, oh, you gotta believe this. This is right. And then basically disinformation gets reproduced through channels of misinformation.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, misinformation is unintentional spread of information that's not true, whereas disinformation is intentional spread of facts that are not real.
Exactly.
Okay. So why are we then talking about misinformation and disinformation in social media, and how does it have an impact in our lives?
So I think first of all, we gotta start with, of course, misinformation in the age of digitalization is a lot easier to share on a large scale. Like it isn't anymore bound by transmission. So before you always had misinformation, right? And you always also had disinformation, people trying to tell stories that had an effect on other people with malintent, for example.
Yeah.
But before it was kind of bound by geographical limits, by newspapers only being regional or national even. And nowadays we have the internet, so the internet is very like unlimited to some extent. If I sit in Sweden and I share a story on my social media and I have friends all over the world that reshare this, suddenly it's all over the globe. Like this little story that I created or that I found on the internet suddenly is all over the place. So then, of course, we're speaking on a much larger scale with much more effect on personal life, on political life, on health, economy, you name it. And then the other thing is, which is kind of connected to that. Misinformation nowadays has also more of like precedence in politics.
Mm.
For example, we had the whole discussion in the US election. Did Russia have an effect on it? Did it not have an effect?
Yeah.
Do like algorithms, do bots have an effect on how we see politics, how we assess our environment and our social interactions? Like all of these discussions take place nowadays, and of course they have an impact.
Yeah.
Like, of course, I feel much less secure when I know that I'm surrounded by wrongful information. Like, how do I differentiate between like wrong and right? Like, what is true, what is not true? That, of course, has an effect on me. And I think considering such subjects as polarization and the COVID-19 pandemic and health decisions based on that, like, that is very important that we know how to differentiate between true and not true, fact and counterfact. Like, how do we assess this? So I think that is why it's especially interesting to talk about this now. And then, of course, you have currently the whole debate with Facebook. How much is Facebook to be held accountable for what happens on their own platform? Are they supposed to regulate this or not?
Precisely. So, but like if you any social media user know, especially now after um COVID-19 or during even COVID-19 now, that social media has fact checking. So there is, if there's talking about certain keywords, vaccines, etc., there's going to be a fact check that you can click on. Same thing was during U.S. elections, the Biden-Trump elections. Everyone who was talking about it in social media had the fact check come. So can we trust this process? Is that something that could be used more broadly? Could that kind of be used as like, okay, Facebook does have a responsibility, but they do it this way? Does it work?
So I think one thing to consider in this regard is, first of all, most fact checking nowadays is either limited by certain terms
Mm-hmm.
or by language, even.
Yeah.
So, for example, on Facebook, the criticism still stands that Facebook, after the 2020 election, built back a lot of its safeguards against misinformation, which was what was revealed in the whole whistleblower conversation. So, for example, Haugen said, um, by quoting Facebook, they basically said, "Oh, good, we made it through the election. There wasn't riots. We can get rid of civic integrity now," which is, by the way, a quote from a New York Times interview. But like, you have that. You have Facebook basically cutting back on investing in fact checking.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, Facebook is used globally.
Yeah.
Facebook has users all across the world in a lot of different languages. However, the vast majority of fact checking only fact checks English.
Yeah.
You have a little bit here and there, especially during the COVID pandemic. It was like amped up a lot in different languages as well. But the majority still is only in English. So the English speaking countries basically have a lot more fact checking than the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So of course there's still vast amount of misinformation. And then another argument, the third argument, is that fact checking is based mostly on written text. So by either writing a word in a different way, like misspelling it, by putting information on in a video or on a picture, you can evade these fact checks. So it's fairly simple to basically circumvent their system. And then you also have discussions with these institutions like Facebook, like YouTube, Twitter, all of the big social media platforms when it comes to how much money are they supposed to invest, how much capital, like in terms of employees, in terms of money, in terms of knowledge, how much are they supposed to invest in fact checking?
Mm.
Because Facebook made it very clear, and Haugen kind of illustrated this in the whole conversation, that Facebook's interest is not to scale this up, it's to scale it down because it costs money.
Yeah.
And of course, as like an economic actor, it is all about money in the end. So how do we make it attractive to fact check more, to make it more safe, make it more obvious if something is wrong? For example, Twitter also decided for the longest time period in regards to Trump not to completely remove wrongful statements, but to just put them behind like basically a shield that you can
Mm.
click away if you're still interested. It was a cover, oh, this is not true, but you can still see it.
Mm.
So yeah, there's different approaches, and you could argue that some are more effective than others, but in the end there's still we still deal with a lot of misinformation, and then of course also behind that stands a lot of disinformation.
Mm.
Mm.
So kind of like the question is, in the end, who is responsible? Is it the users or is it the platform as well?
Yeah, and you could also tie in politics there.
Yeah.
So for example, if platforms can't be held accountable due to legal restrictions, um, how does politics react to that? Is it the aim to basically make them accountable, make platforms or make companies accountable for what happens on their platform? Is it more the narrative that the user needs to be hyper aware of and basically fact check for themselves,
Mm.
which has taken precedence in a lot of discussions before? But it is kind of on the brink of change now. I think there was a lot of discussions about how to affect like or how to change Facebook's attitude towards this, to basically illustrate this with just one company. But I think Facebook has also taken precedence in this discussion due to a lot of revelations in the past.
Yeah, and also Facebook does have a bit of a monopoly when it comes to social media platforms. We saw it just a couple of weeks ago when Facebook had problems, server problems, that was extended to WhatsApp. It was extended to Instagram. So it is one of the biggest, um, yeah, not monopoly holders, but it does have a massive amount of space in social media. So I think when we talk about misinformation or disinformation, and social media in general, it's kind of like that. Facebook is such a big player that, not saying that we should only focus on Facebook, but due to the size of it, there should be extensive focus there.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm gonna go quickly back to what you just said. You were talking about Haugen. Can you explain a bit more about that to people like me who don't know much about it?
Sure. So basically, Haugen came forward as an employee of Facebook. She was head of, I don't remember the exact title, but it was basically an oversight committee for the, yeah, civic integrity of the platform.
Hmm.
And she came forward with a lot of information about how, first of all, Facebook did know about the negative effects it has on youth, namely on Instagram. It knows about political extremism on its platform, how polarizing posts have a effect not just in the digital world but also lead to violence offline, like
Mm.
in the real world. There was also knowledge that Facebook had about or not knowledge, but that Facebook basically had talks within its own company about removing safeguards after the election, um, yeah, so a lot of very like negative and I would say worrisome information about
Mm,
the knowledge, the extent of the knowledge that Facebook had, where they always said, "Oh, like we don't know about this," or basically dismissed these questions. So that leads to the thought, like, is it that Facebook is more interested, of course, Facebook as an economic actor is interested in making money,
yeah.
and if they know that polarizing content, aggravating content, is increasing the time that people spend on the platform, basically increasing the amount of money that Facebook can make off of them as users, um, how does this stand in relation to Facebook as a moral actor on the market?
Yeah.
So yeah, so there's an ongoing investigation in whether or not it's possible to make Facebook accountable for this. Because, of course, there's also very special circumstances in the US when it comes to digital actors, market actors. Like, when can you charge them with something with malintent, or when can you not? So it's a tricky conversation. But it was very informative to the extent that Facebook knowingly increases digital and offline violence and basically contributes to polarization, to mental health concerns with especially in youth. So all of these things kind of came out of her stepping forward, quitting her job, coming forward with a lot of like the internal documents that Facebook scientifically wrote, like in studies that Facebook made on their own platform and the effects that that had on people. So yeah, that is basically very uh, brief of what she said.
Okay, so she was kind of like a Facebook Snowden.
Yeah, basically.
Interesting. So we have talked about a lot about how where we can see misinformation, what kind of platforms, what Facebook, for example, can do or does, um, and how it has polarizing effects on political events, on COVID-19, for example. But misinformation or disinformation is also shared more or gets more visibility than something that is not classified as misinformation. How have we gotten to the era of like misinformation spreading this way?
I think that's a really interesting question because misinformation, as you said, is much more likely to be shared.
Mm,
And that is because it addresses a lot of misinformation is written in a sense that it addresses an emotional response. So it is kind of written either in very alarmist language or in a language that is supposed to kind of like tie into people's fears, people's beliefs, people's personality.
mm,
So it addresses you in a very emotional, very personalized way. So then if you read, for example, every one of us has read a newspaper article. They're usually, to some extent, yes, they address you as a person or address like a certain context, but they're mostly written on a very like factual information base.
yeah.
So it's like, oh, this happened, this is why it happened, and this is why it's relevant, la di da di da. So basically, your stereotypical newspaper article. And then when we think about misinformation and we think about, for example, Brexit, we think about the Trump era, we think about all those really like high profile cases where people malinformed
Mm,
another group of people. So if we think about that, a lot of that was targeted towards people's very deeply ingrained fears of irrelevance, of like livelihood protection, like all of those type of things. And we can see that again now with COVID, like with, oh, there's this like authority regime which is going to force you to wear a mask, they're going to implant you with a microchip, all of those narratives.
Mm.
Is very like attacking, very aggressive narratives that of course they create a certain fear in people, so then it becomes an emotional response. I become aggravated, I want to share this with people because I think this is relevant to know.
Mm.
So then misinformation gets distributed
Yeah.
because I respond to this. And another thing with misinformation is that you have often people in your closest circle of contacts sharing this. So, for example, if information comes from my closest friends or my mother, my relatives, somebody like that, then of course I'm more inclined to just accept this
Mm.
than to question this because I trust these people. I have basic trust in these people, so I think if they tell me something, then there must be at least a sliver of truth to this, right? I might question the general message, but I'm at least believing to some extent that this is true. Whereas when I hear from a newspaper across the Atlantic Ocean that something has happened and this is the result of that, then then of course I'm going to be like, okay, this is information, seems like a trustworthy source, but I'm generally more careful with believing that.
You're
There's
more
more.
disconnected.
Exactly, there's a larger disconnect there. So I think that that is definitely a part of why this is so takes such precedence in digital media.
So if we talk about kind of misinformation, disinformation, and how it has spread, how it spreads more, and kind of like the negative impacts of it, who advantages from disinformation? If we talk about like the intentional spread of information that's not factual, that is wrong.
That is a very philosophical question, I would say, because of course, if we speak about elections, there
Mm.
was the whole involvement of Russia in the 2016 election. What this creates, like a lot of this intention, is to create, to disrupt trust to in a sense.
Yeah.
So if I'm able to provide so much disinformation that people start questioning, for example, basic democratic institutions, I become critical of democracy as a result from
Mm.
this, then that, of course, is, I would say, if you're an opponent of a state, beneficial to you
Yeah.
because then you basically disrupt the structure of the state. So, for example, a lot of scientists now talk about how disinformation is going to be, or misinformation and disinformation both will be one of the biggest threats to democracy nowadays because you don't have well informed voters anymore.
Yeah.
Voters are questioning the basic like institutions that uphold our democracy. So then that is a very like like it's a bit hard to speak about this as beneficial to anyone, especially when you're like prone towards believing that democracy is a good thing,
Yeah.
which I would like to say that I am. Um, but yeah, so then it is basically very, very, very dangerous as a concept.
Yeah. So if we talk about, for example, Russian trolls, they've been very much talked in regards of the U.S. elections, whether it was the 2016, 2020 elections. If you want to disrupt the status quo or the trust on democracy in the U.S. context, um, that is a not necessarily easy, but a viable way of going about it.
Yeah, and I think that illustrates very much how important it is to have these fact checks in place. So, Facebook, for example, was, I wouldn't say forced, but let's say incentivized
Mm.
to put fact checking measures and like safety guards in place in the 2020 election for it not to be to be the same as in the 2016 election with a lot of interference from out of state. Um, similar things happened in other countries where you had, for example, a German election recently where they found out that a lot of the uh, Green Party's posts were targeted by misinformation, like more so than any other party. And that was another thing where you could see that mostly the liberal argument is a lot of times targeted with misinformation. Yeah, so I guess it is very, like, it illustrates the kind of importance that we need to safeguard this. We need to safeguard this process because you cannot only rely on users to fact check everything, because as I said before, if it comes from a person of trust, we're less inclined to fact check. And of course, nobody is going to fact check the whole platform.
No. There's too much information to be going. You would spend most of your days, and the hours in your day wouldn't even be enough to fact check all the information that literally is thrown and bombarded on your face all the time via social media. So
Exactly.
not
So
viable.
it has to come from a platform level. Hmm.
So we just talked about how it is impossible to do fact checking by yourself. You you don't have the hours in your day to do that. Is there something that we can as individuals to do to combat um, misinformation and disinformation?
I think the first thing that everyone can do is kind of be a bit aware. So if you encounter something that has very like alarmist, emotional messaging, then be a bit more careful with it. Like maybe see if you can find if this is really true. Like this is something that is kind of an indicator, you could say, of misinformation. Then the other thing is, of course, and this is a no brainer, if you are suspicious of a message, don't share it. Because if you share it to two people, they share it to two people, and so on and so on. We
It's
can all imagine.
exponential.
Exactly. It goes into this big bubble and it gets more and more visibility. So it's kind of very helpful if one person disrupts this chain and just says, "Okay, I'm not going to share this." The more people that do that, the better. Then on the other hand, you also have a lot of people that take to social media now, especially during the COVID pandemic. It was very like dominant that people who are knowledgeable about these things that are covered by a lot of misinformation, such as the pandemic, take to social media and take initiative to inform truthfully. So it's always nice to kind of hear these stories as well. I recently read about a story in the Time magazine about moms in the US that are in work in the medical field, that are doctors, nurses, uh, health professionals of some sort, that talk about COVID-19 misinformation that gets distributed, the harm of that, and also what is the right information, and then circulate that. So try to like give those people more exposure and less to people that share very aggravating emotional content, because that is not just like helpful in terms of misinformation, it also feeds the Facebook algorithm
Hmm.
basically.
So we've had a interesting discussion about misinformation and disinformation in social media. Just to kind of wrap it up, how would you summarize what we've been talking about today?
So I think you can kind of summarize it in 3 points, right? So first of all, misinformation is very, very common, and we encounter it on a daily basis, whether we are aware of it or not. The second point is misinformation is very dangerous, and as such, we need to put pressure on platforms to kind of regulate this to a better extent, and also more all encompassing extent, so that it's not just English language posts, not just text that gets regulated, but it is more like all encompassing. There's more capacity there to regulate it. And then the third point is kind of connected to that. We need to be aware of this being a problem. And by having awareness, kind of understand, okay, we take part in digital communities, we encounter misinformation. That is a problem, and how do we behave if that happens?
Mm.
So, to be more aware of misinformation being there, but also misinformation kind of being navigated by users.
Okay, so there you have it. Our first Freda podcast episode, topic being misinformation in social media. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed what we were rambling today, and we'll be back.